I was supposed to have this devlog out sooner, and I was supposed to have more things ready to show. But once again, things didn't go according to plan, and I would delay this devlog even longer, were it not for the fact that I do want to upload something this month, plus writing a script seems like a good way to organize my thoughts. So allow me to present .NetHack, a dungeon crawler roguelike inspired by the classic games from the genre, like NetHack, and developed with the framework of .NET. Yes, the name is the only reason it exists. That and the fact that I want to learn to use the .NET framework but don't really care for making normal apps as much as I do games. An idea that it was competing with, and one due to being probably easier, was an Inscription-style game featuring Rocco's Basilisk. I might come back to that one at some point, but for now let's focus on what we have here. And what we have here is a dungeon generator, one that can be given a number of rooms to generate and will place them in as square of a grid as possible, connecting them with corridors in a manner that ensures that all of them are reachable and that there are some alternate paths. Sounds simple, right? And well, it probably would be simple, if not for one seemingly innocuous idea I had: room variety. With games like Enter the Gungeon or Children of Morta in mind, I wanted to do something more than just a bunch of square rooms with haphazardly scattered connections and points of interest. Maybe that was enough some years ago, but we have the technology to do things better. I wanted the player to be able to enter the remains of an old temple lined with broken pews divided into sections by large pillars and with an altar waiting at the far end. A trap-filled corridor that opens into a treasure vault. A dark throne room where you are beckoned to approach by one sitting on the throne long before you can see them. And other things too, but these are the examples I picked for a particular reason: their directionality. Rooms like that really don't work well unless the only offered entrance is on the opposite side to the point of interest. So I needed a system which would build a dungeon out of predetermined rooms, while taking into account where their doors are to ensure that all of them can be connected and we won't get a situation like two dead ends connecting only to each other. This also wouldn't be a problem by itself if I did what games like Enter the Gungeon and Children of Morta do, and allowed the dungeon layout to sprawl in whichever direction it wanted. But if I'm making the dungeon on a grid of tiles, then I am going to use the whole grid. Especially with some ideas I had that involved things like being able to tunnel through the walls. And I don't know, it just fits the idea of an old school dungeon crawler better in my mind. The combination of these two design decisions led to a long process of experimenting and troubleshooting, and at multiple points manually reviewing the generation logs, just trying to figure out the correct logic for the algorithm. A process which is partially captured in the task notes I was making during that time. But I went through that once and have little interest in doing so again, so let me instead try to summarize the final result of many iterations, which is based on the wave function collapse algorithm, meaning that we start with a grid of rooms where every position, except for the ones which are forced to not exist to match the target number of rooms, is in an undetermined state where it can be any room in any orientation. Then, one by one, these superpositions are collapsed into specific rooms, and based on them limitations are applied to the rooms that are still undefined, based on three rules. These limitations take form of forcing the rooms to have doors pointing in specific directions, and the rules are as follows. 1. For each direction in which the newly determined room has a door, if it is adjacent to an undetermined room, that undetermined room gets a forced connection in the matching direction. 2. For each area of undetermined rooms, if it has less than 2 inward connections, that is, forced connections to an undetermined room, a new random one is added. And 3. If any undetermined neighbor of the newly determined room is going to divide an area when it itself becomes determined, we check each of the areas that it would create to see if they have any inward connections. If they don't, force such a connection on the room that would create the division. This process is repeated until all the rooms are determined, resulting in a grid where each cell contains the information on what room to spawn, how it should be rotated, and whether or not it should be flipped. Then the rooms are actually placed on the map. Some rooms have variation in their sizes, and this is where their exact dimensions are decided. Finally, connections between the rooms are decided by scoring all the possible connections between 0 and 6 points, depending on where each room's door is located in relation to the other room. The resulting list of possible connections is sorted by that score, and then the connections are chosen by going down the list and picking ones that connect two groups of rooms into one. At the end, a few additional connections using still available doors are chosen to create some loops through the dungeon. The generator tries to draw corridors with as few turns as possible, so a straight line if the doors happen to align, or two bends placed at random alongside the corridor's length. If that fails because there is something blocking the way, the generator falls back to using a proper A-star pathfinding algorithm. And I didn't want to use a pathfinding algorithm as the default, as if you want to minimize the number of turns and assign a penalty to them, it results in it taking the turns as late as possible, which doesn't look good on the map. A corridor takes the form of a line of empty tiles surrounded by walls, where the walls can be overwritten by other corridors should they end up close together or cross over. If for some reason you've been staring intently at the maps generated in the background, you may have noticed some strange connections that don't seem to match what I described here. This map that I came across during testing is an extreme example of such. But there is a simple explanation, and that is null rooms. Do you remember when I mentioned that in the initial grid some rooms are forced to not exist? The way I handle them when placing rooms is by using a room that consists entirely of nothing tiles. It still has a varied width and height, and the algorithm still tries to place this box of nothing, because that is how I ended up dealing with the fact that since the room placement effectively prints the rooms left to right and top to bottom, if I just skipped over null rooms, the empty space would always end up on the right side of the row, which means less variety in dungeon generation, and I couldn't have that. And that brings us to these strange connections. You see, there were two ways to deal with null rooms in terms of connectivity. You could treat them as having no connections and link other rooms around them. That's the boring answer. What I went with instead is treating them as rooms with available connections in every direction, with a special clause that if they end up with only one connection, they need to either get a second one or lose the one they have. This way they end up working as corridor extenders and crossings. And this whole tangent brings us back to this map and how the corridors were generated, which I marked here, the squares being the approximate location of the null rooms. I don't have a further point to make or a transition to another topic from this, I just wanted to show a neat result of the algorithm. There are, of course, things still missing. Minor improvements like reducing the number of turns in null extended corridors by aligning the null room's connection point with the doors that connect to it wherever possible would certainly help. There is also an edge case where you have two null rooms connecting to each other, and only one of them is able to connect to a different room, which still results in a dead-end corridor, even with that special clause. A bigger feature will be what I'm calling a great hall system, which is basically another way to break up the monotony of a grid by generating rooms that can take up more than one space. I'm pretty sure I got that idea from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Another two things that will take the dungeon generator to another level, hopefully, are generators and cellular automata, both of which can appear within a room to further customize it. Generators can be used for objects that are meant to be in the room but don't have a precise placement. Let's say piles of gold in a dragon's hoard, or levers used for a puzzle, or enemies specific to the location. And the cellular automata will serve to enhance the room layouts themselves, allowing for generating things like caves, mazes and such, where you have rules for what they should look like rather than fixed appearances. The goal of all this is to create something that is actually worth exploring and learning about. I want the dungeon to be a part of the game you interact with, rather than just a generic space where you interact with enemies and loot. And I also want it to be versatile enough to accommodate all the random ideas I will no doubt have. And I suppose this is as good of a place as any to talk about my design philosophy. While it is undeniable that a game called .NET Hack, drawn with ASCII characters, is calling back to classic dungeon crawlers, the NetHacks and Angbans and Stone Soups and what have you, I never actually played any of them. I have played Paphos and Pixel Dungeon, but I didn't really get into any of them. The aforementioned design of the dungeon being just a generic set of rooms where random traps, items and enemies are scattered didn't particularly appeal to me. And the early game being rather blunt does not mesh well with high difficulty. And I don't know who thought that having to waste one of each of the items you find on figuring out what they do was a fun mechanic. It is, I suppose, worth noting that Pokemon Mystery Dungeon also has some of these issues, and plenty of its own ones, and yet I still love it. But that one isn't as bad due to not being a roguelike, due to its difficulty being notably lower, and also the fact that I was playing it primarily for the story, the gameplay serving as just a good enough filler. To a degree, I am hoping to have a similar thing here, a story that can develop across multiple runs, much like how Hades does it. But I of course would like to make the gameplay also able to stand by itself. And to contrast these completely classic roguelikes, there's Cardinal Quest 2, which is a game I 100%ed twice. A game where each level has its own distinct method of generation and its own pool of enemies, and a game where from the start you have a decent amount of options for how you approach enemies, as every character has a couple of perks and equipment packs that affect gameplay meaningfully, and the first level is guaranteed to contain a skill. Although it is not perfect in that regard, I do distinctly remember getting frustrated with the early game of Chapter 2, which features a lot of wolves and not much else. These two games, being Cardinal Quest and Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, are my main source of inspiration, and I will be aiming to replicate what they did well, and improve upon what wasn't as good in my eyes, while throwing in my own ideas along the way. Some of the notable decisions I made so far are: 1. The structure will be that of a roguelike rather than a roguelite. You won't be able to purchase upgrades that would make the future runs easier, but you can unlock new stuff to find during the runs. 2. Similar to Cardinal Quest, you will have character skills with various effects and various types of cooldowns. I quite liked how in there some skills had unique methods of recharging, such as standing still, gaining experience, landing hits, or sharing a mana bar with all other spells. What I would add to it is a skill or two that is specific to the equipped weapon, representing ways you can use it besides just smacking the thing immediately in front of you. One type of skill would definitely be the weapon's attack, with a unique way of targeting spaces, such as a sword being able to cleave, or a spear to thrust at range or be thrown, similar to what Crypt of the Necrodancer does with its weapon attacks. 3. Generic enemies should have a decent variety in their behavior, which should be further augmented by different abilities and stat lineups that are set up in a way that makes it possible to learn them by just playing. And if you know an enemy, they shouldn't be much of a challenge. They should only cause problems in 1 out of 4 scenarios. If you approach the enemy the wrong way, such as charging a ranged enemy out in the open, if you are out of an important resource, you got yourself surrounded, or you haven't been gaining enough strength and you just don't have the stats. 4. Bosses, and to a lesser extent mini-bosses, should play by their own rules and the player needs to adapt to them. It's no fun if a boss is just an enemy with more stats that you can tackle the same way as you do everyone else. At least it's no fun if that's the only kind of boss out there. 5. There will be character creation, involving a selection of 3 aspects: character's race, class, and ambition. It is very much taken from the class-race background structure of D&D character creation, and the combination of the 3 will determine your starting stats, skills, and equipment. I am also considering making ambition give you a side quest for the run that grants a special benefit once fulfilled. 6. During the runs, you'll be able to encounter recurring NPCs with questlines that lead to new unlocks, lore reveals, special boss fights, and such. Currently, I don't have any plans for having a hub, so all their interactions will be taking place within the dungeons. 7. Items will take form of equipable weapons and armor, possibly also having things like backpacks that give extra inventory space, and consumables. The consumables will be fairly common, and the inventory space quite heavily limited, as in my experience these 2 factors combined do a good job at limiting the item hoarding. There might be ammunition for ranged weapons. 8. All units get a single action per turn, in a fixed order. There is no speed stat that would occasionally let you stick in an extra turn. 9. Not 100% certain, but I am currently considering having attributes used for calculating actual statistics, as well as item and skill scaling and prerequisites. They would improve randomly when you level up, with your class race combo determining the chance for each of them to grow, much like Fire Emblem does it. 10. Leveling up will give access to new skills, passives, and stat improvements, possibly in a format similar to D&D's feats, where you can just freely pick ones you want from a list, though some have some prerequisites. In this case, I would probably make a lot of them have prerequisites as to not overwhelm the player early on with options. And 11, a completely random idea I had was to make equipment steal the core unit mechanics from auto chess, as in having 3 of the same item lets you fuse it into a stronger version, and each has an assigned type or types, giving you synergy bonuses with strength depending on the number of items of the given type that you have equipped. Finally, there are 2 concepts that I wanted to talk about more, which I wanted to use as the core appeals of the game. The first one was playing with the fact that this is a game made in a framework meant for applications, and as such it would be relatively easy to lean into it, making it look like a normal Windows app. Some of it you can see in what I've got so far. The main menu, rather than being its own screen, takes the form of a menu panel at the top of the app. Tiles on the map can be selected in much the same way as files in an explorer, meaning that you can hold down Ctrl to select multiple ones, Shift to select a line, click and drag to select a rectangle. The map area also scrolls in the way you would expect, normally scrolling up and down, left and right if Shift is held down, and zooming in and out if Ctrl is held down. Originally, I wanted to go further with that, incorporating UI elements in whatever way I could think of. Some of them still seem like decent ideas I might implement, like making items that give you some kind of special vision open windows, which you overlay over the main gameplay window to reveal stuff. But another idea I had was to incorporate minigames into the gameplay that play around with the UI and software-related stuff. However, after making 2 of them that could work as lockpicking minigames, I decided that they aren't all that fun and scrapped that aspect altogether. What I am hoping will work a lot better is the game's setting, or rather settings, because that was something I had trouble deciding. Should this be the classic fantasy dungeon crawler, or would this app-like presentation fit better with something futuristic or cyberspace or something like that? This resulted in an idea along the lines of my aforementioned want to be able to put whatever I come up with into this game. The idea to give the player an option to unlock different settings, and then meld them together in any combination before each run. Each setting having its own races, classes, enemies, items, rooms, and possibly unique mechanics. If you want pure fantasy, you can pick the 2 or 3 settings that fit that theme and beat the whole game like that, and I will probably design it in a way where that number of settings is the reasonable amount of content where there is plenty to learn, but can actually be memorized without too much trouble. But if you want to dump the entire toy box out on the floor, and the prospect of a goblin with a laser rifle doesn't scare you, that is also an option. This will also give me a good way to decide when the project is in a good enough state to properly release, while at the same time leaving the door open to expand it at any time with new settings. Maybe I could even set it up so the new settings are something you can import so anyone can make them. But of course that will only be worth doing if there will be anyone who cares about the game enough to want to add to it. Also, since devlogs have stopped working as a means to keep me accountable for the progress I made, I think I will give dev streams a try. Since unlike devlogs, which have to be scripted, recorded and edited, and as a result risk falling to the same procrastination that is already harming my productivity on the actual project, a stream I would only have to set up once, then as soon as I press the start button, my only responsibility is to actually get things done over the next 2 hours or so. I don't really expect people to find them worth watching, but I am hoping that just the fact that a record exists of what I'm doing will be enough to make this an effective method. Currently I'm thinking of trying it twice a week on Mondays and Fridays, starting around 8 PM GMT. And that's all. Thanks for watching if you got to this point, and until next time, farewell.